Richard, there's a few changes as far as environmental regulations are concerned?
Well, right around New Zealand you're seeing a lot of change in environmental regulation. It was 1991, in fact, the RMA first came into being in New Zealand, but we're probably going through a whole second or third wave of the planning cycle, and what we're seeing is a lot more regulation landing at the farm gate, whether it be in a Canterbury context or in the Horizons, Wanganui-Manawatu area. A lot more issues hitting farmers for water quality is the main driver, and regulation particularly around the nitrate leaching from those farms. And what that's leading to in some contexts is quite a lot of farms moving from farming as we know it into farming for via a consent process with the council. And that's a very significant shift for farming, going through that change to actually have to apply for a consent, not just in the past as we would have applied for a consent for, say, dairy shed effluent or maybe irrigation water quantity, but now for the very act of farming and working that farming system through to know what's happening in terms of the losses to groundwater or the losses of both phosphorus and nitrogen to water bodies, and that's really giving the regulatory focus for quite a change of thinking for farming right around New Zealand.
I guess, was it the Taieri Valley that started it all? Because they had very strong restrictions, didn't they? Quite some time ago.
Taieri or Taupo? There was
Taieri was the one that I was thinking of, but probably Taupo as well.
Yeah, well, Taupo to me was the one that led the charge, where the lake issue there, keeping a pristine lake, led to the zone around the lake. Quite a bit of central government money going into Taupo to keep the lake as clean as possible, and that actually was the first process of really integrating overseer into regulation. By overseer, what I'm meaning there is the nutrient budgeting model that has been developed over probably 20 years. Principally starting point was around fertiliser recommendations, but now looking more at using the model to look at all the nutrient cycling and the losses in particularly downwards from the nitrogen by the way of nitrate. So back to Taupo, for instance, the focus there was on reducing that, keeping the lake absolutely pristine, and that really went through the court system, and overseer landed as the tool of choice. It's a model that's being developed all the time, and as it's being developed, it goes through new versions. The version changes cause a bit of complexity and can change the landscape for farmers as well. So yeah, interesting place we're in. We're seeing Environment Canterbury taking a lot of steps with their planning changes that are seeing significant numbers of farmers having to consider whether they need a resource consent to intensify, and in many cases the ability to intensify, if it is going to lead to increased nitrogen loss, really doesn't exist. Those what we'd call red zones through the Canterbury Plains. It's not to say they can't change their system, but if the amount of nitrogen that system produced increases, then effectively that may be either a non-option or an option that you have to go to council to position a consent for.
It's very complicated.
And unfortunately every layer that comes along makes it more complicated.
Yeah.
Yes, so we are finding that. So Horizons was probably another council where you'll recall moved into that, I'll call it farming by consent, for a number of the dairy farmers in sensitive catchments, and something in the order of 400 farmers there over the next 2 to 3 years have to go through a system of applying for a resource consent for their existing operation.
So they're already doing it, they're already
without
practicing.
Even changing their system, they need to go through a consent process. So that's quite a challenge.
And if they don't get that consent?
Well, we really don't want to go there.
No, that's a fair comment.
So they will obviously structure their operation so they will get a consent, and there's some targets by land use capability, classifications of what each land use capability should be driving towards for a lower nitrogen loss. And so farmers have to be consenting their activity and showing a pathway of nutrient reduction, nutrient loss reduction.
And it's up to them to do that?
Well, effectively it's their process to work through. It's their consent that they will hold to run their farm for the next 20, 30 years, and so getting it right is very important.
You, as an organisation, are there to help people with smart maps and such?
Well, Ravensdown's been an interesting place in this development. Firstly, we've kind of been involved with overseer for a very long time. We have a large field presence of about 70 agri-managers. Now, obviously, they're there with fertiliser understanding, nutrient understanding, soils and farm systems understanding. That's really the key to getting the nutrient budget right, both now, maybe as a baseline, and into the future for the different farming scenarios. So we've had to tackle this new emerging space in quite different ways. We set up a team in October 2013, Ravensdown Environmental, which is actually a consultancy service charged by our consultancy. Because the nature of the work was getting more and more specialist and it was unevenly spread across the country between different sectors and different councils, it became virtually unmanageable for Ravensdown to do that as its normal course of business as a service for its farmer shareholders. So we had to pull back from that and say, how do we deliver when a farmer is really having to evaluate their whole farming business and position a resource consent around nutrient loss. So that's where that team started, and it does a lot of work around, if it's in Canterbury, farm sales. So if you're selling a block in Canterbury now, you really have to sell it with its existing nutrient status into the new owner.
That was going to be one of my questions.
Because, due diligence, huge.
And that is the reality now.
Yes,
and you've got to have it.
So we're doing that all the time for any, and it's not just farm sales, farm leases will be covered as well, because the incoming lessee has to really do what the lessor, if they were the previous farmer, was doing in terms of nutrient loss. Doesn't mean the system has to be identical, but they may have no headroom to change the nutrient loss. So if you're picturing buying a farm and you had to figure out, well, what's my enterprise going to be? It's not what I imagine it might be, it's what I may be constrained for it to be. And that's takes a lot of thinking through, especially if you're going to the bank and saying, I'm borrowing some money for this new enterprise. Now, the banks are obviously waking up to this quite quickly too and saying, well, we better check this enterprise is going to hold together. Yes.
Lincoln University's dairy unit is already but self-imposed, and they're living, and that's working with you guys.
Yes. What Lincoln University dairy farm has been doing for proactively is saying, well, the new regulations coming through in their case for the Selwyn Te Waihora subzone are imposing reductions, and how will that farm manage those reductions? So rather than doing that next year or the year after, they've brought that forward and are trying to do it now. And that's so they're significantly modelling their operation all the time to see if how they'll meet those categories of losses, and then obviously putting that information out for the, all farmers to look at and
that's
say,
their website, isn't it?
Website, focus days, all of those sort of extension media they'll be using to get engagement with farmers who are going to have to make the similar choices in the next year or two or three.
That's scary.
There's a lot to it, and I don't think we should be scared by it, but we should be very aware of it, because it is fundamental to the business that the farm is operating under. And so just as you plan your calving and plan your rotations and every other farming activity, here is something you have to do to really model your farming system now and into the future, so that it is resilient to the regulatory environment that we now find ourselves in.
Do we see the use of legumes a lot more, or clovers and things to naturally...
Well, it all gets factored into that overseer model, and so it's not so much about how the nitrogen gets there, but how much in total. So and then what form and how it's been grazed, and the losses you might get from the urine patch, or whether the wintering system is handled in a certain way. That will determine a lot about how the models predict the nitrogen losses. And then you want to set up a system that's robust enough to have a bit of flexibility with the seasonality, but not going to pop you over a certain number that might have the council one day knocking on your door saying you're having to report these numbers in annually, and if they're starting to not align with the baselines and the predictions, yes, then some tension points are going to develop.
Thank you very much indeed.